Du Fu, Moonlit Night. Tonight, my wife must watch alone the full moon over Fuzhou. I think sadly of my children, far away, too young, to understand my absence or remember Chang'an. In fragrant mist, her flowing hair is damp. In clear moonlight, her jade white arms are cold. When will we lean at the open casement together, while the moonlight dries our shining tears? So we finished with Li Bai, and now we continue with Du Fu's pentasyllabic regulated poems. He is the best represented poet in this section as he is in the book. There are 10 pentasyllabic Liu Shi poems by Du Fu here, which almost amount to a third of his total output in this anthology. Just as Li Bai was conventionally supposed to excel at the old style poems, Du Fu excels at the regulated poems. So some of the poems we're going to read are among his most famous, and in fact, I'm pretty sure that the one I've read to you today and the one that I'll read to you tomorrow are poems that are very commonly included in anthologies and in translations of Du Fu's poetry. So what's the topic of this poem? Well, it's on the surface of it, it's pretty conventional. It's another poem about separation, parting, but it has a peculiarity, at least in the ones we've been reading until now. This is the separation of a married couple. So this is based on biographical information. This is Du Fu's separation from his wife. This poem was composed little after the beginning of the An Lushan rebellion. Du Fu was captured by the rebels, and he is a prisoner in the capital that was taken by the rebel army. He is in Chang'an. His wife and children are not there. They're in Fuzhou. And he writes this poem longingly missing his family. Now, we've encountered a lot of poems about parting and separation in this collection, but most of them were about scholar officials ceasing to see each other, and the few that were about the separation of lovers were very vague and indistinct. I think we read a few of them in the ballads section, and they felt a bit impersonal. So the impression one gets is that the poet writing them is not really experiencing a separation. He is just writing a piece of a genre. Or even if he is experiencing a separation from a beloved wife or lover or whatever, couching it in the old format and in the old words and in the old conventions makes it feel as if it's just an artificial exercise. So probably here I am exercising Western romantic attitudes towards literature, what the new critics would call the intentional fallacy, the view that poetry expresses or illuminates the soul and the thoughts of a noble person. But anyway, this poem feels alive. So this feels like a real poem sent by a man to his wife and children whom he misses intensely. And you could say this is a love poem as well, a love poem for his wife. And that's not too frequent in Chinese poetry. Love poetry appears, probably more than it usually does in this anthology. But, you know, love is one of the great themes of Chinese classical poetry. But husband and wife love is not that well represented. And, you know, Confucians were a bit, you know, they had a bit of this proto-Victorian moralistic view about showing affection and love. And they were, you know, a bit censorious about any overt manifestations of affection between a man and woman, you know, considering that they were too tempting and too distracting from moral thoughts and moral activity, and that many rulers and ministers got distracted because of beautiful women. So here we have the contrary, you know, there's this, just the simple words of a man, well, not so simple, he is Du Fu after all, but you've got the words of love of a man for his wife who is far away, and, you know, just expressing how he wishes to be back together with her again. Okay, as usual, let's take a look at the poem couplet by couplet. So the first couplet will introduce the situation and will introduce us into a trope that we've encountered repeatedly in this anthology. The moon viewing the moon as the only action that can join together two friends or two lovers who are apart. So sometimes also visiting each other in dreams can join people who are apart. But it's a very common trope for a poem to be speaking of two people gazing at the moon while far away. Tonight, my wife must watch alone the full moon over Fuzhou. So Fuzhou, I think, is in Shanxi, so not so far from Chang'an, really. But I imagine perhaps out of the clutch of the rebel troops. And the wife is alone. Her husband is far, her children might be asleep, and she's watching at the moon, just as Du Fu is watching at the moon and thinking about her. So the next couplet gives us a little bit more detail and shifts the focus from the wife to the children they have together. Du Fu is also thinking about his children. I think sadly of my children far away, too young to understand my absence or remember Chang'an. So the children are young, they're babies, or they're very, very young. And of course, they're too young for politics. They're too young to understand that their father is, a prisoner at the capital. They're too young to understand or even to remember their experiences at the imperial capital and the significance that Chang'an has for China. Okay, next couplet shifts the focus again back and squarely to the beloved wife. And this is quite an effective parallelistic couplet, and the parallelism is quite transparent even in the translation. In fragrant mist, her flowing hair is damp. In clear moonlight, her jade white arms are cold. So we get a description of the woman under the moonlight, and she's beautiful and sad. Yeah. So look at the parallelism. Fragrant matches with clear, mist with moonlight, flowing with jade white, hair with arms, damp with cold. Finally, the last couplet imagines a future together when Du Fu and his wife will again be reunited. When will we lean at the open casement together while the moon dries our shining tears? So this is a rhetorical question. Du Fu sighs and wonders when, if ever, he will be reunited with his family again. And, he uses a slightly over-the-top poetic image of what will happen when the reunion will take place. So he says, when will we be together, leaning at the open window, gazing at this, implicitly, gazing again at the moon as united, just like now we're gazing at the moon separated. When will we gaze at it again while the moonlight dries our shining tears? So just as the sun dries wetness during the day, the moon is imagined as being capable of obliterating, of drying out the tears at all the suffering, at all the separation, perhaps the tears of joy when this meeting finally takes place. So, quite a nice poem, quite a nice poem. As I said before, I find it very effective, and here your points of view on poetry and your cultural background on poetry is decisive. I like this poem more than the others for the reasons I've stated. It feels like a real poem. It feels alive. And in the West, we tend, there have been different tendencies of interpreting poetry and of defending different styles of writing poetry. But one very strong tendency is the romantic one. And, it's this idea that poetry should express the uniqueness and the individuality of a person. And, this poem feels individual, feels real. Any person who loves his wife could be a writer of this poem. But, it feels very authentic in the voice of Du Fu. It doesn't feel like an aesthetic exercise, which is not something bad in itself. Most of literature, poetry, can most of the time be, if not exclusively, up to a great deal, an aesthetic exercise at, creating a beautiful work of art and mining and adapting and polishing previous conventions and words for a new recreation. But again, in great artists, we expect originality, but also authenticity. And I think both can be said to be present in this poem by Du Fu, which justifies his reputation as China's greatest poet.